Hi, this is Alan Gassman. I'm here with Kevin Miller, and happy 529 Day. It's May 29th, 2015, and a very interesting and very valuable topic to understand, 529 college savings plans. Kevin has a lot of expertise in this area. As you can see, he's got a lot of letters after his name: CPA, CFP, CPWA, a smart guy, and a very dedicated financial consultant. So I'm going to let Kevin lead us through this presentation. I think if you listen carefully, you will learn a lot. If you would like to get a transcript later of the presentation, let us know. Also, we'll be sending you a video replay. And when you go to the video replay, you could even play it at 125% speed so that we sound like Mickey Mouse. This presentation is brought to you by Estate View Software. If you're interested in a free trial on Estate View or to attend one of our free workshops for Estate View, just send us an email, let us know, and we'll be glad to make that available to you. So Kevin, I'll let you lead this discussion, and I'm looking forward to learning and coming away with some nice new strategies for my clients.
Awesome. Thank you, Alan. Thanks for having me as a guest today. Appreciate the introduction. It is a great day to be talking about college savings. I always look forward to this day. It gives us a reason to make this a priority. I've been in the business for about 20 years, and in my early 20s, I found this to just be a really interesting topic. You know, as an advisor, when polled, most clients would describe their number one priority as things like retirement or concerns of running out of money. Their number two is helping their kids or saving for college. So this was a topic that really early on in my career I enjoyed because it gave me an opportunity to add some value to client relationships. I spent a lot of my early time of my career researching 529 plans and trying to develop sophisticated ways for clients to save taxes and meet their financial goals, specifically related to college. So today's course objectives, we're going to cover a lot. You know, Alan and I were talking earlier, this course is probably easily a 90-minute course or longer. There's going to be some things that we don't dig into. But my hope is that you come away with a few different things, either something you can take to your family or to your own practice. So we're going to talk a little bit about developing the plan. What kind of conversations might you have with your family related to your college savings goals and your family's potential college needs? Talk a little bit about the college landscape. I mean, the short story there is college keeps getting more and more expensive at a time when inflation is high. It's also high for college savings. We'll talk about the variety of different options you have. Even though today is 529 Day and we should probably focus most of our attention there, which we will, there's also a lot of different ways to get to those goals, and we want to compare and contrast those so clients understand and families understand what their options are. We'll spend a lot of time in the details of 529s. They've evolved a lot since the beginning of 1996 when they first came into play, and it seems like, you know, Congress continues to try to make them more attractive. You know, keeping my own political views aside, I do say that this is one of the best things that the IRS and Congress have done for families to make sure that people have the ability to focus in on college savings and try to make that more affordable. So you're going to see as we go through the presentation that 529 plans really stand out in so many different ways. So anytime you're thinking about a financial plan, whether you're with your spouse or with your kids or whatever it is that you're trying to think through, you know, we would need to understand what the priority of this goal is. For families with different means, of course, it's going to be different. You know, for many of our families in the high net worth space or ultra high net worth space, it's really not a question of if they're going to save for college, it's how much and how many generations they want to provide for. For our Main Street middle class families, you know, they're probably dealing with a lot of competing interests, saving for retirement, paying down their house, trying to figure out, you know, their cash flow, their tax situation, especially when you consider most parents are going to start their families young in the early parts of their career, you know, speaking generally. So trying to help clients understand balancing these goals is important. I always use an analogy I call the airplane analogy, which, you know, if you've ever been on an airplane, it says that if you lose cabin pressure, the mask's going to come down, put yours on first before you put the one on next to you. And I think that there's some elements that relate to college savings. We want to make sure that our clients that are focusing in on this have also, you know, taken care of their own personal situation. It's a lot easier to help later when your financial situation's in good order than to maybe misprioritize. So it starts with understanding what are the balances of those goals. The other thing you need to give consideration to is what are your own personal values. My clients have a variety of different values related to how they view college. Some people say, you know what, I paid for my own college, my kids are going to have to do the same. Some families are not very debt adverse and they think, you know what, if the kids take on debt to go to college, that's okay. Some people have real high level goals where they say, I want to be able to pay for my kids undergraduate, postgraduate, medical school, and I want to be able to afford Harvard. So they have really lofty goals there. But understanding what it is that you and your family want to accomplish is an important part. Part of the reason that that's important is to decide not only how much to save, but where to save the money. What's going to get you closest to your goal? Some families want to see the kids have some skin in the game. So they are saying, I'll pay for tuition, but really room and board and those types of things are going to be borne by my children. Another question would be, do I want to treat all my kids the same? That difference between fair and equal? I have some clients that say my goal is to just provide $50,000 of college expenses. If they want to go to junior college, they might end up with money left over. If they want to go to Harvard, they're probably going to end up with some student loans. So depending on what your goal is will also, again, dictate your savings levels. And then one of the things we're going to spend probably the most amount of time on is the comparing and contrasting between different savings vehicles. Some people want a lot of control and flexibility. Others want to really maximize their tax savings and their investment returns. So understanding what those things might be are going to help lead us in that direction. I'll also say as we go along, I love to hear questions. I have no problem steering off of our slide deck, addressing questions that clients might have, and we'll do our best to make sure that we cover all those. To the extent that you have a question that might already cover in the material, I'll just direct us there. If your question is pertinent to that slide, we'll try to answer it right away. So I talked a little bit about the landscape. If you look at college inflation, we're usually seeing rates between 6 and 8% annually. Now, depending on the school, the state, different things, you're going to see different levels of inflation rate. But the way I would look at it is most families should plan for an inflation rate that is going to be equal to their long-term rate of return. Something in that 6 to 8% range, compared to historical traditional inflation of that 3% range. So I'm from Michigan, so you'll see that there's a little Michigan bias in this because these are the schools that I'm most familiar with. But I also tried to provide some context outside of that. So if you look at just the University of Michigan's tuition for an in-state resident, that's $19,500. If you add in cost of attendance, which is a figure that usually includes essentially room and board, fees, other types of expenses that might come along like parking, they're looking at $35,000 a year. If you adjust that for inflation at 6%, you can imagine that that's going to become a really large expense. And most families view those types of things as really a liability on their balance sheet. University of Florida has really favorable in-state tuition. So if you're tuning in from Florida, you're going to find that your in-state tuition tends to be a little more favorable than the national average. As a commonality, most out-of-state schools are expecting much higher rates of tuition costs. Again, that varies by school, but the takeaway here is just if you haven't given consideration to the change in college costs since maybe you were in college, it's worth just plugging in and seeing what maybe your goals are going to align relative to the costs that are out there. So what are some different ways that you might want to save or prepare for this expense? I say prepare is an important part too, because maybe some people won't find this as part of their critical savings plan. Despite the fact that I think they should, there might be other ways that they're going to manage around that. So 529s, we're actually going to talk about those later, but that's the number one option that you have available. Coverdell IRAs or ESAs have kind of become a thing of the past. UTMA or UGMA accounts, which is essentially a brokerage account in the name of a minor, offer a lot of flexibility. Some people might just say, you know what, I'm going to put money in a brokerage account, a taxable brokerage account, and I'll use that money when the time comes. There's also options within your Roth IRAs, life insurance policies, just a traditional savings account, and then loans. We don't discuss that today, but I do want to talk about that in a broad term. There's lots of different ways to fund education through loans. Some of it could be personal loans, some of it could be a home equity line of credit or a margin loan, and then of course the most common would be a student loan. So we don't get into those in detail, but they're of course important to note. That would probably be a whole presentation in and of itself. So I'm going to cover the one that I think has the least amount of use and do it as quickly as possible, and that's the Coverdell IRA or the ESA account. The problem with the Coverdell IRAs is that they're just a thing of the past. The contribution limits are too low to really make a difference. Most people that have middle income or higher can't contribute to these, and they just have less flexibility. So when 529 plans came into existence, Coverdell IRAs essentially became obsolete. I can only think of 2 people that have them. Both of them have kind of treated them as a little bit of a nuance in their overall situation. It's just another account that they have to keep track of and supervise. So these are really a thing of the past. You can roll them over to a 529. So that is one option for a lot of families, but we won't dwell on this because I don't think they're being used very often. UTMA and UGMA accounts are a lot more common. So, I see this a lot where, kids born, grandma and grandpa give them a few $1,000s, or parents are collecting money from birthdays and holidays and putting those in savings accounts. Most traditionally, those are going to be accounts established for a minor at a bank or a brokerage account. The advantages to this savings route is that you don't have any income restrictions. So it doesn't matter how much money you make, you can use these accounts. You're not going to get phased out. And they are the most flexible. So we'll talk a little bit about the drawbacks of some of the other options, but the one downside to 529s is they're really designed, and all of the favorable features of a 529 are designed to use it for college. Where with an UTMA or an UGMA, you know what, if your kid doesn't go to college or they get a bunch of scholarships and you just want to pay for their their first home or something like that, the UGMAs become, a more critical option. Okay. I'm noticing it looks like I might have lost Alan. I'm going to keep going in case that's
I'm here.
Okay, Alan's still there. Okay, there he's back.
All right.
So the disadvantages of UTMA and UGMAs really come down to, I think, control. So once you have put money in an UTMA or an UGMA, and I should define that, Uniform to Transfer Minor Act or Uniform to Gift a Minor Act is what that acronym stands for. So the downside to funding one of these accounts is that the parent in most cases becomes the fiduciary. That money needs to be used for that child. You've essentially lost control of that money once they reach the age of majority. So you lose that. You also, these are the most penalized in the financial aid calculation, would be an asset in the name of the minor. So if you think that you might be able to qualify for financial aid, these are not the asset to own. The tax consequences, each year as that generates interest or dividends or capital gains, you're going to be looking at an investment tax. We don't dig into the details here, but that could be unearned income. If it's in excess of $2,700, it's going to actually be taxed at the parents' rates. So that's not a very favorable thing. And again, these are irrevocable. Once the gift has been made, this is not something that you can take away. You have a fiduciary responsibility to those beneficiaries. So summary there, very flexible, often can be used in combination with other savings goals. The disadvantage is really about control and protection. We talked a little bit about taxable investment accounts very, very briefly. What I'm describing here would be a family that says, we're going to open up a Schwab brokerage account. We're going to put $1,000 a month there. It's not in our kid's name. We're going to just grow that money. And maybe we'll use it for our retirement. Maybe we'll use it for college. Maybe we'll use it as gifts to our children. We're not sure, but we're just going to use an after-tax brokerage account. Similar to the UTMA, you're not going to have that tax protection or those incentives from a tax standpoint, but you are going to have the complete flexibility investment options available to you. You do maintain control. If your kids upset you, they become, out of favor, you don't want to pay for something for them, you don't have to worry about your fiduciary obligations. You can use that money on yourself, or maybe they just won't end up needing it. The disadvantage is predominantly going to be you have no umbrella related to tax protection. So all the income generated in that account is going to be taxed at your rate. For our high net worth families, you could be looking at, average tax rates of over 40% when you add in capital gains and net investment income tax and state taxes. So these would be the least tax efficient option for you. Roth IRAs, my opinion is this should really be a safeguard. This should not be something that you use your Roth IRA with anticipation of paying for college, but it'd be remiss to not talk about this. There are options within your Roth IRA where you could take a distribution from that IRA of the contributions you've made, or you can waive the penalty on the earnings if you use it for education expenses. I believe these should be used predominantly for retirement. 529s offer better advantages in my opinion, but the one benefit I could see here is, let's say you're meeting with a very young family with limited means. They're really trying to go back to that first point that I made, balancing between their own security and college savings. if they're in a really low income tax rate, this could be the right thing for them because they're going to cover potentially, you know, 2 goals at the same time, and have flexibility down the road. But ultimately, I would not recommend that you're setting up a Roth IRA with the idea that it's going to be used for college. Whole life insurance is often another thing that is, I would call it kind of sold to clients. This idea that, hey, buy this cash value life insurance policy. You can always pull the money out later. You could take a loan against the cash value. You know, we don't have time to cover that in great detail, but you will hear this as a vehicle. And I will say that, again, balancing competing interests, this could be something that could make sense for a limited amount of clients where they say, I really don't have enough money to cover all these goals. I need insurance. This is a reasonable rate. If I need to use this for retirement or I need to use this for college, I'd have that option. Again, I think just like with the Roths, your insurance should be insurance, not a savings vehicle. But this is an option that sometimes is talked about. So without further ado, the heart of today, the history of 529s, what's a 529 and why are those probably the best options? So a 529 plan is a state-sponsored plan. Even though there's federal IRS regulations around how these accounts are taxed, these are sponsored by the state level. They offer a ton of flexibility to families as it relates to how the money can be used for a term we're going to hear today called Qualified Higher Education Expenses, QHEE will be the acronym we use. So tons of flexibility there. They're unique in many ways. They offer a triple tax advantage, and they also, in my opinion, you know, maybe Alan will have some perspective to add as well here. They almost kind of violate some of the estate traditional rules because they're an asset where it's outside of your estate, but yet you still have some control. And that's a bit unique in most circumstances. Normally, when we give money away, we have to give away the control. But in 529 world, we actually maintain some of that. So we get a triple tax advantage especially for families that live in a state with an income tax. You'll also hear 529s referenced as a qualified tuition program, okay? So not all states have them, but essentially every state does. We'll talk a little bit about kind of selecting a plan as well. The history of 529 started back in 1996. I won't bore you with that. The point of bringing this up is that 529s have evolved. And I think that the IRS and Congress have done a great job of helping that evolution. These started out as prepaid tuition plans, which evolved into savings plans, which are more like a 401k. And if you fast forward, what you saw was just this constant effort to make it more affordable, easier, more tax advantaged for families to take advantage of this. A point that I want to stress is that all 529s have the same tax code related to things like beneficiary changes, qualified higher education expenses, tax exempt growth, penalties. That's a federal IRS level. But you will find that if we dug into your respective state, that you're going to find that state by state plans will have nuanced differences. So some of the things we're going to talk about, it's always going to be worth making sure that your state plan meets all of the same criteria. So you don't have to worry about the tax exempt status, but you might see different contribution limits, different investment options, things like that, okay? I'll also add that we're going to talk about a prepaid 529 plan, which is essentially pay tuition now to use later. And we're going to talk about savings plans, which are much more like a 401k. When I refer to IRS rules on 529s, the IRS doesn't distinguish between those two. The states might, schools may, but the IRS doesn't. So those are going to be consistent, okay? So we'll start with the prepaid tuition plan. That was the first one that was there. And I think a good place to start, especially if you're tuning in from Florida or Michigan by chance, the prepaid tuition plans there are relatively attractive. So what you're doing in this example is you are prepaying today's tuition rates, and the rate of return that you're going to get is based on where your kid goes to college and the inflation that occurred during that period of time. So your rate of return will be somewhat in your control, which is where the kid goes to school, but it's also going to be based on the overall inflationary rate, okay? Prepaid plans probably should be supplemented with a savings plan as well, because they only cover tuition, they don't cover room and board or the other expenses that children may see. So either that or an UGMA account, if you're really trying to keep the kids out of debt, or you're trying to avoid a burden for yourself down the road, considering these being complemented with a savings plan is a great option, okay? So let's look at an example. So the Michigan Education Trust, may have been the first 529 plan technically. I'd have to double check my memory on that, but it's one of the oldest that's been around. The way that it works is that you pay $541 per credit hour. So that's about $65,000 to prepay tuition. It's essentially prepaying the cost of tuition to the University of Michigan. It's kind of the way I like to look at it. So if you were to look at that and say, if I did that right now, the current tuition at the University of Michigan is around $19,500. So I would get a discount of about 14% if I were to just prepay tuition for the University of Michigan. I've got two little girls, 15 and 12. Maybe let's see what their trajectory looks like, but that would probably be a good deal to have not only the inflationary protection, but also to have the discount. Now, if we're looking at a school like Western Michigan University, which is a smaller school in Kalamazoo, you might know the name because they just won the NCAA championship for hockey. If you follow along, you're actually paying a premium if you pay the Met costs and then they go to Western. So you're actually going to pay a premium because of the difference in the cost of tuition. Okay, so that's an important thing to give consideration to. This goes back to where do they go to school matters. So now let's walk through a very quick example. So if I prepaid the cost of Michigan 18 years ago with a 6% inflationary rate, the future value of that would be about $215,000. So the rate of return that I would have experienced is pretty solid, about a 7% rate of return. If you consider that as a risk-free investment, that's a very strong rate of return. You took the risk of owning a CD and you got a 7% rate of return. If you compare that to Western Michigan, so I prepaid at a higher rate, I lost some money because of the discount. They go to 4 years at Western Michigan. My rate of return is still decent, but it's not nearly as competitive. And if you were to compare those two, so let's pause for a second and kind of add a comparison. Let's just say that I had put that money in a savings plan and I got an average rate of return of 7%. If I took the money out of the savings plan, I'd have a modest advantage to the savings plan versus the prepaid if my kid went to Michigan. But I actually would be down 1.5% annually if my kid went to Western Michigan University. Okay, so again, if you have questions, chime in. I'm happy to dig into those. So there are also an evolution here of trying to create a prepaid plan for private college. Now, this is not widely used, so I won't spend a lot of time on it. If you compare the assets, there's about $345 million in these prepaid college plans. It's kind of a group plan with 300 different participating schools. If you compare that to savings plans, I see a typo in my slide. I apologize. That should be 483 billion. Okay, so these are small in comparison to savings plans. The biggest issue is that there's limited participating schools. So if you think, hey, my newborn child is going to go to Harvard, I know they're going to go to Harvard. I went to Harvard. I'm going to participate in this private college plan, and they don't go to Harvard. You're going to find that lack of flexibility is pretty painful. So this is an example of they don't go to a school in the prepaid plan and they instead go to Michigan State. Walking through those variables, the cost of attendance would be about $18,500 for Michigan State. If they went to that school, they're only going to get about a $50,000. So let's say they put $50,000 into the plan. They're only going to get about a 2 to 3% rate of return. So not only did they get really a below average rate of return because they didn't go to that school, they took that money out and they went elsewhere. They lost out on that 7% rate of return. So there's a major opportunity cost in this. I would not find this to be an attractive option for many families. So I would steer away from these for most families because I think it's really difficult to determine, is your kid likely going to private school, when they're a newborn. In our slide deck, which is available to you, there is a list of schools if you're interested. There's also a hyperlink in the top right corner if you're interested to see if what schools qualify. Okay. So now into really the meat of the presentation related to savings plan. So I've described earlier, a prepaid plan is really more like a pension. It's got a defined outcome, low risk, can be a great idea. The savings plans are more like 401ks. So as a reminder on some of those things I mentioned earlier, you're going to get tax-exempt growth, tax-free growth on your earnings for qualified withdrawals. We'll define what a qualified withdrawal is in a minute. Think education expenses. Got very high contribution limits. Most states have a contribution limit in excess of $300,000. So you pretty much could pay for about any college that you wanted to. There's also no rule that says you can't have multiple 529s for beneficiaries in different states. So if you were just incredibly aggressive about this, you could have a plan in Michigan and you could have a plan in Nevada. Okay, still have to worry about gift rules, but as far as account balances, it doesn't cross over to different states. You've got a lot of investment flexibility. I'm going to continue to use the comparison to 401ks. Most college savings plans have options that are going to feel a lot like a 401k. You can pick some individual funds. You can build a aggressive or a conservative with a click of the button, or you can use what's called an age-based plan, which means that it gets more conservative as time passes, a lot like a target date mutual fund. Most states have a state tax deduction available to those that make a contribution. So if you live in a state with a local, state, and income tax, you probably can get a deduction if you're contributing to your plan. So without getting on my soapbox with this, I've seen a lot of situations where, especially early on, say 20 years ago, where broker sold plans would be sold to clients for commissions, and they would actually end up foregoing their state deduction. So instead of them going directly to sign up for the Michigan plan in Michigan and getting a 4.25% deduction, they were encouraged to go to a plan like Virginia, where the brokers are actually able to collect the commission there. So kind of a buyer beware. If you are contributing to a plan and you haven't spent time thinking about the implications of there, I would encourage you to look at your statement and make sure that your plan is that your state, if it has an income tax deduction, that you're contributing to the plan that would give you that option. And if you're working with a CPA, I would draw their attention to that, make sure that you're getting your biggest bang and you're not contributing to a state that's not giving you that benefit. Okay. 529s also have the most favorable financial aid treatment of all options. So yes, it does count against your financial aid, but it counts in the most, how would I say it, the most attractive of all of the assets that are collected in the FAFSA application. 529s are the most favorable. They're in the most favorable category. We talked about the ability to change things after you've made this gift. So you can change the beneficiary in a 529 plan amongst family members. All of these things we're going to continue to define. So if you have questions on those, you're going to get some more information as we go along. So, early on, what you can see is that you've got a tax advantage, got tons of flexibility. In most cases, you have very low cost. So speaking about the Michigan plan again, the cost is, I think, around 0.3%. And that's administrative fees. That's also the investment expenses. So low cost investment options. Anyone can put money into the 529 plan. So there's no income restrictions. Remember, the Coverdell IRA is pretty much non-existent now for that exact reason, okay? So if you're kind of doing any comparing and contrasting, this isn't that much different than your taxable brokerage account in that example. You can put a ton of money away, going to get a tax benefit for this one though, and you have no income restriction. I mentioned that you've got this control from a parent standpoint. So beneficiaries have no right to claim these assets. Your kid can't turn 21 and call, the Florida plan or the Nevada plan and say, hey, I think I've got a 529 account. I really want to buy a Ferrari. Can you send me my money? They won't acknowledge that person. The beneficiaries have no claim. That's different than an UTMA or an UGMA. If you have an UTMA or an UGMA account established in your kid's name under their social security number, and they called Charles Schwab or Vanguard and identified themselves, if they're over the age of 18, chances are that representative is going to put them in contact with their money, okay? So that's an important thing too. I would say, again, given the IRS and Congress a lot of credit, they tried to find ways to avoid families being stuck with any excess money. So we'll try to debunk some myths here, but one example would be if your kid receives a scholarship or has a military benefit, you can get that money back. You will pay income tax on the distribution, but you won't pay any penalties. So they've tried to say, hey, if you've done all the right things and your kid's just very gifted and they get a full ride scholarship, what could I do with that money? I could say, hey, Lily, you did a great job. I'm going to take $25,000 out of your 529 because you had a $25,000 scholarship. We're going to pay a little bit of income tax, but here's that money outright, or I need that money for retirement, or we're going to give that money to a charity, whatever that might be. You have the ability to use your scholarship. I think it's technically called a resource. So it doesn't necessarily just have to be a scholarship. I mentioned military benefits. You have the ability to draw that money out without paying that penalty. Okay, so in that case, you're probably better off than what you would have been had you invested the money in a brokerage account, because you got the tax, you got all that tax deferral along the way. All right, some more advantages. You'll notice lots of advantage slides here. So you've got the flexibility to shift between beneficiaries. So if you have 2 children, 3, 4 children, and you want to move that money accordingly, you can. So let's say your first child has 100 grand, but they only use 50,000 of it, and you need that money to pay for the second kids. You can move that money, no tax, no implications, essentially. I will put a caveat there. Make sure your CPA knows about that. Make sure your attorney knows about that. When you change beneficiaries, you have to be conscious of any gift tax implications. That can usually be worked around or may not even be applicable, but again, it's worth noting. I already mentioned the favorable tax treatment for FAFSA. So the beauty is these just keep getting better. So this is pretty much, since I've been in, since this has been my career over 20 years, all of the things I've talked about so far have always been there. But recently, Congress came through with the Secure Act and said, well, we're going to try to continue to make this more flexible. What's the number one thing I hear about when people say, I don't know if I want to use a 529 plan? It's, what if my kids don't go to college? That's the number one thing I hear. What if my kids don't go to college? Or what if I have money left over? What if I overfunded these? I used to build projections that say, don't fund more than 90% of your expected need, because you didn't want to have money stranded. But that's a myth now. If you have money stranded, you can actually convert 5 years worth of Roth IRA contributions over to a rollover. So basically you can roll over your 529 residual over to a Roth IRA. That's new in 2024. There are some stipulations. You can't contribute to a Roth and do the Roth conversion. It's basically considered a contribution. You also still have to have earned income. So some of those rules kind of blend together, and it has to be done over 5 years. So I think that this is going to be a more widely adopted part of long-term planning. Truthfully, I haven't seen it heavily adopted yet, because a lot of times clients just say, well, I'm just going to keep it there. I can always do that later. Okay, but that is a new, exciting change for 529s. One thing I also like about 529s is they're not just a high net worth tool. They are a great high net worth tool, but they're not just a high net worth tool. Most plans can be established with no money up front. You can make $25 contributions to get started. So for families that are just looking to get started, or young families that are balancing a lot of different competing interests, it's really easy to get started. Conversely, though, they're also great tools for our ultra high net worth clients. The 5-year front loading allows for you to contribute 5 times your annual exemption, plus split giving if you want to, in 1 year. So if my math is right, I think that's $190,000 of potential year 1 upfront savings. So they're great tools for estate planning purposes as well. Okay. I mentioned that nuance where you can change the account owners, you can change the beneficiaries. We need to be mindful of what that might do to your estate tax. So, talk to your attorney first, but you've still got that flexibility, which is kind of unique. They've also added in the ability to pay for K-12 tuition expenses. So many families are using this as a means to help grandchildren with private school. And they added in apprenticeships and non-traditional schools as well. So, you don't have to go to a public university to use this money. There's a lot of different schools. Cosmetology is one that comes to mind. Apprenticeships, trade schools often qualify for college as a qualified higher education expense. Okay, so lots of flexibility here. So what are the disadvantages? They are a more narrow use than the UTMA or brokerage accounts, because they're really geared towards the college savings side. So you do have a little bit less flexibility. You do have limited investment options. I think that's probably a good thing. Unless you're working with a professional, the idea that you're going to go out and try to build your own portfolio. One of the things that 529s came under pressure in 2008 was that too many people were working with advisors that had or plans that were overly aggressive. So these limited investment options that most plans offer actually become more conservative. So if you think of what happened in 2008, the market's major decline happened in September when everybody's tuition payment was due. Those folks that had their money in a brokerage account and hadn't given consideration to rebalancing the portfolio to something more conservative, were left trying to pay tuition at a much lower cost. The age-based allocations solve for that. they get more conservative as you get closer to college. So my 15-year-old's 529 plan looks more like a 70-year-old retired couples, because we need that money in a few years. Okay. So I think that this limited investment option is actually a good thing, not a bad thing. Investment risk is probably the same. I put that as neutral. I don't think you're necessarily taking on more risk in a 529 on the S&P 500 than you would in a brokerage account, but you could maybe limit your investment risk with a prepaid plan. You could enhance your investment risk by taking speculative investment decisions, which of course I disagree with, but it's still something that sometimes people say, like, I can't pick individual stocks in my 529. So I would discourage you from doing it, but it's true, you can't. They might be more expensive than a brokerage account, but not by a lot. And then the most common one would be the 10% penalty on the earnings. So for example, if you put $10,000 in the plan and it grows to be worth $20,000, and you decide to take that money out and buy a car, you're going to have a $10,000 non-qualified higher education withdrawal, okay? Because you didn't use it for college. That $10,000 is going to be ordinary income tax, and it's going to be hit with a 10% penalty. So that'd be $1,000 penalty. You're not penalized on the principal, only the earnings, okay? A couple of other small disadvantages to be aware of. If you are receiving a state deduction, make sure that you understand the rules related to your state plan. So one that comes to mind to me, Colorado has a recapture for a non-qualified distribution. So if you were putting money in, they said, hey, that's fine. Keep doing that, we'll give you a deduction. But if you've now gone out and bought a car versus go to college, then we need to recapture that benefit you had. So look at your state specific rules. You can't double dip on your credits. So if you paid for college expenses with a 529, you can't then also take a deduction or an education credit like the lifetime learning credit with money that you paid for. Now, we don't get into this. Talk to your CPA about it. You might be able to shift income around a bit and see if your kids can qualify for those, because there are some creative ways to do that, depending on if they're being treated as a dependent. And then lastly, gift tax implications. So of course, some of the things we talked about have no gift tax implications, like life insurance or loans or brokerage accounts, but we do have gift tax implications with 529s. I'm going to pause for a second. Alan, do you have anything that, as you're listening through, that you'd like me to spend more time on?
No, you're doing great. I don't want to get in your way. Keep on going.
All right. So what is a qualified expense? 90% of the qualified expense is going to be the tuition and room and board. That's pretty straightforward. If you were to call a university and ask for their cost of attendance, or if you were to reference, hey, I need to know what is going to qualify from a 529, this is becoming a very routine question for the financial aid department. So let's say you've got, 10-year-old, 15-year-old, somebody in that kind of, you're doing the final planning, but they're not there yet. If you call the University of Florida, go online, type in tuition expense, you can just find that. It's really the cost of attendance. It also includes things, I kind of say anything on the syllabus. So if they need if they're an artist and they need a sketch pad, if they're in computer science and they need a laptop, those types of things are going to be available as qualified higher education expenses. If they have a special needs service, for attending college, that's going to be available. Hopefully you're kind of picking up on the theme that they've done as much as they can to make this available and attractive. We already talked about K through 12 expenses. The one thing that I would reiterate, prepaid plans are not going to cover all this. They're only going to cover the tuition and the fees. So that's where the 529 comes in as well. One thing that I will also note is that if you have a child that's going to live off campus, the amount of qualified higher education expense that you can claim is limited to the cost of attendance, and that's really the amount of money it would take for you to put them on, in the dorms. There's a number that every school has. It's also the number that drives what kind of a loan you can get. So they've closed some loopholes intentionally. You can't buy $1 million condo or $2 million condo in Miami, send your kid to the University of Miami, and then pay their rent out of the condo or the mortgage payment on the condo and say, well, that's cost of living. You would be limited to filing that, you'd be limited to whatever the University of Miami says it costs to live there, okay? So you can't, there's no gamification on that. You're limited to what the school's cost of attendance would indicate. I mentioned the apprenticeship programs. So this is a great thing. I mean, I think we're seeing some of this happen in the culture of our society. We're seeing fewer people maybe enroll in traditional public college, public universities. So those folks that are going to pursue an apprenticeship may be able to take advantage of $529. Student loan repayments, you can now use up to $10,000 from your $529 to repay a student loan. I think that's a great thing. I don't know if it makes a tremendous amount of sense. I think it's a nice catch-all because you're probably incurring a lot of interest on that loan to only then use this. But perhaps you want your kid to have some skin in the game, and that's an incentive to say, listen, you're going to have to go get a student loan, but we'll pay $10,000 off your student loan if you graduate with a 3.5 or better. So maybe there's some planning dynamics that come along with that. What doesn't qualify? So transportation costs. That's one of the more common things that I have people ask. If you live in Michigan and your kids going to the University of Miami, you can't fly them back and forth. You can't buy them a car. You can't buy them a transit ticket or Uber. Those things don't qualify. Things like insurance premiums, games, hobbies, things. You can't buy them new golf clubs, because they're playing golf on campus, whatever that is. So I think that's a pretty obvious one, as it just relates to the things that you can't cover. So if you know what you can do, pretty much assume the rest you can. Highlighting state tax advantages. This chart, again, you've got the slide deck, shows the number of states that have state tax benefits. So just to clarify the words that I'm using, is this would be an income tax deduction, not in a state. This is a state income tax deduction available. And you'll notice that most states that have an income tax are offering either a credit or deduction. It's hard to beat that. If you look at, I'll use Michigan again as an example. If I'm going to put $10,000 away and I'm going to immediately get a 4.25% deduction, I'm $425 ahead every year than what I could do if I said invested that money in the Nevada, Utah, Colorado plan. So, I've already got $425 more. So those investments are going to have to really outperform, which is unlikely, to ever recoup that. So the state piece is very important if you live in a state where you think you might be eligible for this. This chart just shows the benefit of that if you were to maybe say make a total of $100,000 or $100 a month contribution. Okay. Looking at our time, we're going to have about 15 minutes left. I do think I'm a little over halfway through, but just to make sure that I think we cover some of the more important things, I might skip through some of these, and we'll make sure that next time we allow for a little more time. But I think we're going to cover some still important information. So beneficiary changes. Who can the beneficiary be changed to? So think traditional family tree, spouses, children, grandchildren, siblings, parents, aunts, and uncles. You can go up and down, and you can go left and right, cousins and their spouses, and in-laws with the same relationship. So you've got a ton of flexibility there. This also includes stepchildren as well. So they really, when you look at what they were trying to accomplish here, they pretty much said, if you want to move money to anyone you're related to, we're fine with that. We just don't want you to put a bunch of money away and give it to somebody else. That's where the non-qualified beneficiary changes. You can't move that to a friend, okay? You also can't move it to, your fourth cousin, twice removed, and say that that's a relationship. They've narrowed that tree down, okay? So there's no income tax implications. There could be, depending on if you're going up and down generations. If you're going down generations, you need to be mindful of GST. I won't dwell on this. This would really become more of an important and critical item if you had a situation where a family needed to move hundreds of thousands of dollars. Because if they needed to move 10 grand, they're going to be under the annual exclusion. If they need to move $30,000, they could do that in December and qualify for their annual exclusion, and then do it again in January and qualify for the next year's. So really GST and gift tax implications would really be something that you'd be probably heavily coordinated with your attorney and your CPA to begin with, so they would help keep you out of trouble there. But you just want to be mindful that that is something that exists. So I think I already spent enough time on the UGMA and that comparison. So if you want to spend a little bit more time there, this is, I think, slide 34 in your deck, but we spent some time there. The other item that we didn't talk about, and I could easily add that as a bullet point in the early part, would be, what if you don't save at all, but you've got the means to pay for the college expenses? You can make a direct payment of tuition for anyone, and especially your children, but anyone, and not be subject to a gift tax. So while this isn't exactly funding or pre-funding, it's not the most efficient. It is a way to say, you know what I'm going to do? I've got the money, and my neighbor's kid did a great job mowing my lawn all those years, and I can afford to do it. I'm going to pay $25,000 of his tuition and write a check directly to the university. You can do that. That's an unlimited thing, and it also applies to medical expenses. But it's not an efficient use of things, and so we're looking at that here. So you could do the same thing by front loading a 529. You get the $190,000 into the plan. You could then use that money for college or K through 12 expenses. So it'd be a much more efficient way of doing this. And depending on what your state income tax situation is, you might also get a tax benefit. So not something to lose sight of, but something that you probably have more efficient ways of getting that done. I mentioned that each plan, each state has their own limits. So, we look across the country, I don't see any limitation with the exception of Georgia that's less than, say, 400 grand. So you got a couple, most of them are well over $500,000. So, the idea that, oh, I can't save enough is probably been eliminated with 529s. Another example of putting 529s on a pedestal here. So what are some of the things you consider? Talking about the non-qualified expenses, that's something you're fearful of. If you have a child that's, a freshman in high school and is saying, I don't really think I'm going to go to college, we need to start thinking about what that looks like. If you think that you're eligible for financial aid, 529s are still very helpful, but they are going to have an impact. And then lastly, we talked a little bit about that scholarship implication. So just as a reminder, if your kid gets a scholarship, you can withdraw that as a qualified, essentially, reimbursement. Okay, so that's a nice thing. We're going to go through a couple of recaps. I've already talked a little bit about the rollover piece, but I didn't get into the details. So I talked about the ability to roll over money from the 529 up to 35,000, which is 5 years worth of $7,000 contributions. That's how that number comes about. But again, Congress was wise. They said, we're not going to let this be something that we're going to let people overfund in order to get money into Roth IRAs. We need to have some stipulations around that. So the plan needs to be open for at least 15 years in order to qualify. And the contributions that you intend to roll over need to be at least 5 years old. So you can't next year say, I'm going to put 35,000 in the 529 and then I'm going to use that to fund my kids' Roth IRAs. What I like about this, though, or I think a planning point, if you're talking to your clients, remember how I said you can open up these plans with $25? I think anyone that's trying to be a good steward of their money and meeting with an advisor should go ahead and open up a 529 plan and put $25 into it a month, just simply to start that clock running, so that to the extent that you do save more money, that you end up in a situation where you can use this down the road. Okay, so some really long-term planning, but to me it speaks to the benefit of, you don't have to put 100 grand in these to have them be beneficial. You could put $1,000 in and start that clock running and start taking advantage right away. Talked about the student loan repayment. So I do apologize. I'm going to try to get through this with 5 minutes left for questions. So we talked about that already, the $10,000. We'll skip over the details here. The one thing I'll tell you is that you can't have multiple 529s at the same place for the same beneficiary, but you can have multiple 529s in different places, so different states. You also can only change the investments and the beneficiaries twice a year. So I think that goes back to another thing of kind of making sure that these are treated a bit like 401ks. We don't want people day trading their 529s or market timing their 529s. So they put some restrictions on that. Can't take a loan out against them either. All right. Another part about 529s that I love is that, when I work with my clients, of course, I'm helping them facilitate all the things that they need to do on these plans. But for families that aren't working with advisors yet, they're really easy. You can go online and set one up very quickly. They do a great job of helping you find reasonable investment options that are prudent. They're easy to make distributions online, set up electronic payments. The investments are easy to understand. They're simple. I would say most people that are saving for college or find that to be important could easily navigate this. So it's not a intimidating thing to get started. This is a more advanced piece, but I will talk a little bit about this. When you make a distribution, you get a 1099-Q. That's the equivalent of, say, your 1099-R or your interest and dividend 1099. That's going to dictate if this was a taxable event or not. So if I sent my tuition to the University of Michigan, my 1099-Q is going to mark that as a qualified distribution. If I sent that to my child, they might mark that as a non-qualified distribution, okay? The important part is, and this will go in our advanced planning next time we do this, would be there could be an opportunity to shift income in the event of a non-qualified withdrawal. So if I take the money, it's going to get taxed at my tax rate. But if I were to say shift a $5,000 distribution and say, hey, Lily, you did really good in school. You need this money for a car. I'm not going to take it from you. You know, it's yours. You earned the scholarship. I'm going to give you the money. You're going to get the 1099-Q. Depending on their income situation, they might not actually pay any income tax. And again, going back to that scholarship idea, if they're not penalized at the 10% withdrawal rate, excuse me, the 10% penalty on a non-qualified withdrawal, even though it's non-qualified, the tax implications could be essentially zero. Okay, so there's something to be thought through there. All right, one other thing, I talked a little bit about some of those stipulations. 529 plans in general, there are many plans that do have age restrictions, most of them don't, okay? So you don't have to worry that at age 30, you're gonna have to make this big distribution. Most of them allow the plan to grow forever. And let's say you're in a plan that doesn't. You could say, well, you know what, my kid's 29, we haven't used all the money. The plan that I am in says that there's a 30-year, you know, they gotta get the money out at 30 years. You could just roll it over to Nevada that doesn't have an age limitation. You can always roll these plans over. There is creditor protection within 529. So something to consider too, you know, back to the UGMA debate, 529s would have some creditor protection status on them. So that is also an important part for our high net worth families. I'm going to use Vanguard as an example to talk about some plan specific details. So Vanguard is, or the Nevada plan is set up at Vanguard. It's got great investment options. So I've talked about those different vehicles. You can do target date, you can pick index funds, you can do dynamic, say aggressive or conservative options. The minimum balance is pretty modest at $3,000. If you live in Nevada, it's even lower. You can make annual contributions and minimum contributions of only $50. The expense ratios are really low. You could build a plan as low as 12 basis points, so that's very low. You get access to institutional Vanguard funds. We're going to talk about age-based allocations on the next slide. Keep it in mind, if you live in Florida, using the Vanguard plan might make sense for you. If you live in Michigan, it might not. Reason being, in Florida, you're not going to get a state income tax benefit, but in Michigan, you would. So this is an example of if you're thinking about where would you open an account, what are your options there? So age-based allocations, pretty straightforward. The younger the person is, the more time they have in the market and the more aggressive the plan could be built. So if you look at the way the age-based allocations work for Vanguard, if you have a 1-year-old and you put $5,000 in and you say, I don't know anything about investments, I don't want to touch this or think about it, I'm just going to put it in the age-based allocation. They're going to say, oh, your kid's 1 year old. Well, they belong in the 0 to 5 age-based allocation. So their money gets invested there. As they work through what's called a glide path, when they turn 6 years old, you don't have to do anything. Vanguard will move that money from, say, 80% stock to 75% stock, to 65 to 50 to 35 to 20. So think about that example with the UGMA account. 2008 hits, everybody's tuition bills are due in September. Person A put all their money in the Vanguard plan and never thought anything about it. Well, when they got to college, they only had 20% in stock. Person B put all their money in an UGMA account and bought the Vanguard 500 index. They did really well, but they lost probably 30% of the value of that account within the month that they were getting ready to use the money. So age-based allocations make this very simple for families. All right, so we've got 5 minutes left. This is actually working out perfectly. I don't think we're going to get to the savings projection. We can always do that. You'll notice in the slide, in your slide deck, that Alan's graciously given you an opportunity to demo a state view. So you can spend some time on a state view. You can walk through how to build one of those projections. And next time we'll make sure we have enough time for that. But I want to leave time for a little case study and also some questions. So let's go through a couple options. So I saved 100 grand in my 529. My kid gets 100% scholarship. What could I do? Well, I could take out 100 grand equal to the scholarship and pay tax and no penalty. So that's one option. By the way, if you're following along, correct me if you think of another option. I could say, hey, you know, great job. We're going to give this money to you. So now it's not a gift. I'm just going to distribute it to her. She's going to pay some tax, no penalty. I could say, well, hey, Lily, you did really good in school. I'm going to leave this money here and I'm going to let it continue to grow tax exempt because maybe you're going to go to med school. I could just leave it alone and use it for a future use of hers. I could say, you know, your sister might need some money because she's going to Harvard. So you did an awesome job. Thanks for, you know, helping do such a great work. We're going to move this money over to your sister to help pay for her school. Maybe both of my kids end up with full rides and I say, I'm going to help out your cousins. Or, you know, maybe someday you need this for your grandchildren. So I'm describing situations where you are changing beneficiaries. Okay, so those are all great options. Could leave it alone, right? Could use it for myself if I wanted to go back and pursue higher education. Now let's say I've got $100,000 saved for each of my children, but my middle child wants to go into the military. What are my options? Well, one of the things that I'm always concerned about is we don't want to strand money with the youngest beneficiary. Okay, we want to make sure that the youngest beneficiary, if we have to cut a check to a university, we want to do that in the last child's, not the first. So what I would be talking to this person about is all the same things we talked about, the military benefit, but also is maybe now's the time to use the middle child's money for the firstborn's education. Let's use some of that money while we can to offset those expenses. Keep in mind, you have to incur the distribution in the year you incur the expense. So you can't go back like an HSA 5 years later and get your money back. So you need to be conscious of matching your expense with your distribution. So let's say that, you know, you didn't realize that you had money left over, but the final year you've only been using it for tuition. Well, get really aggressive about reimbursing yourself that year on things like room and board. You know, collect grocery receipts, find out what the cost of attendance is. Maybe now's the time to buy that computer or plan to pay off that student loan. Another example here, another little case study would be, how could I use 529s to reduce my estate? Let's say you've got a client that's got $30 million and they're likely to be subject to an estate tax. They hadn't given any consideration yet to gifting. So what they do is they say, hey, Alan, what should I do? And Alan says, well, why don't you put in 5 times your annual exclusion plus your spouse's, so $190,000, and all 5 of your grandchildren's 529 accounts. Basically max out the 529s in year 1 and move about $1 million outside of your estate without paying any gift tax. And yep, a little bit of tax work, but a great way to shift, you know, millions of dollars out of your estate to grow tax exempt for all those years. With that in mind, if anyone has any questions, I can hang out for a little bit, but that covers today's presentation.
Kevin, that was excellent, and we do have some questions here. What if you prepay in Michigan and then she goes to Ohio State? Can you use the funds for any place?
Yes. So each state prepaid plan will likely have, I'm going to call it a penalty, but it's not really a penalty. It's a calculation if you use it out of state. What it means is a reduced benefit. The rules that are federal will govern that. You can change beneficiaries, you can use it anywhere, but you won't get that same advantage. So I could add a bullet point there to say, well, instead of going to Western Michigan University, what if they go to Ohio State? What you're going to find is your rate of return is going to be diminished. But you can do it. You're not going to pay penalties. You're just not going to get the same benefit as you would if they went to your state.
Now, if you live in Michigan, do you have to put money into a 529 plan sponsored by Michigan to get the income tax, state income tax advantage?
So Michigan, you do. Some states do not. Some states allow for parity, essentially, where, and I think it's maybe Wyoming comes to mind. This is pulling this from a few years ago. But most states require you to contribute to your state plan to get your state deduction. There's a few exceptions to that rule.
Okay. Is it true that when you take money out of a 529 plan, even when it's had a lot of growth, it's not all income because you prorate the income component and the principal component of the 529 plan for
Yes.
calculation purposes?
Yep. So if I make a $10,000 distribution out of a plan that has 50% contributions and 50% gains, that distribution, even if it's tax exempt, if it goes to the university, 50% of that distribution would have been considered contribution and 50% would be earnings. So I would now have a $90,000 529 plan with $45,000 in earnings and $45,000 in contribution.
So
Same
it can,
calculation applies if it's not qualified.
so it can be a very good deferral tool, even if you end up paying the excise tax on it. If you're in a lower tax bracket when you pull the money out.
Correct.
Okay.
And you can, if you're creative, you might be able to find ways to over time shift that distribution to others that are even in a lower tax bracket.
Okay. Now, can a 529 plan be funded by grandparents, or what about a dynasty trust?
Yes, the answer is yes to both of those. Grandparents can fund them. You can also combine 529s with trusts. That adds some complexity. But yes, you can use 529s to create more multi-generational wealth than just an individual.
Right. Okay. When the beneficiary of a 529 plan gets married, can the beneficiary then be changed to his or her spouse?
My understanding is that in-laws would qualify. So yes.
Okay. And I think you can go one level at a time. Like if I wanted my daughter's plan to use to benefit my grandniece, then in 1 year I could move from daughter to her cousin, and then the next year move from the cousin to the grandniece. So it's almost like a chessboard, multiple moves.
Yeah, I think that you're right. The thing that you'd want to have on your flow chart in that sense, if you were thinking about it, would just be how much are you moving, right? Just because of generation skipping tax and gift tax. But yes.
When you move it, are there situations where you would move a 529 plan away from the intended participant so that they can get scholarships and student aid, and then move it back to them later?
Well, I think that for most families, you'd have to think about what your income situation is. My perspective is that very few families qualify for FAFSA. And if you moved the asset away, depends on who you move it to, chances are it's still going to count as a parent asset. So 529s are the most beneficial. They fall in the most beneficial category on the application. So let's say I moved my money from Lily to Valerie, my other daughter. That asset is still going to be a family asset, and it's still going to be calculated. I'd have to move it outside of her family tree, which might have, I'd have to move it to her cousin and then back. So you'd have to give some consideration to the complexity there, but there might be a planning opportunity there.
Okay, with the 529 rollover, who is the owner and who is the beneficiary?
So if we're talking about the Roth, you're truly making a Roth contribution on behalf of them. So let's say I'm the account owner. My daughter Lily has $35,000 left over. She becomes a CPA, and she's working her first job. And I say, Lily, you did a great job in school. We've got some money left over. I want to help you. Rather than her making her Roth contribution, I would convert $7,000 from her Michigan 529 plan directly to her Charles Schwab Roth IRA. And that would be treated as a tax-free conversion. Lily would have to have income to do that. And she would not be able to make a contribution to her Roth. So I would say, make sure you max out your 401k because mom and dad have your Roth contribution covered. So she would then be the owner of that Roth IRA. And if she wasn't responsible, she could spend it.
Okay. Assuming no state income tax differences, do you prefer the Vanguard Nevada plan over all other Vanguard plans? Or are there other popular plans that are commonly used?
Yeah, there's three plans that I see the most: Utah, Colorado, and Nevada Vanguard. They're almost so similar that I wouldn't encourage a person to go through the process of moving from one to the other if they're already in one of those plans. But those are all plans that check all the boxes. They've got tons of flexibility. They've got really good investment options. Philosophically, I prefer an indexed approach. So Vanguard has that covered. If somebody wants a more active management component, fund families like PIMCO, DFA, those are available in the Utah plan. So depending on the client circumstance, they might find that more attractive. But in my case, it's kind of like Heinz ketchup versus Hunt's ketchup. I'm good with both of them. They're very similar.
Great. Okay, well, Kevin, that's all the questions. That was a fantastic presentation. I'm going to take the transcript of that and go through my transcript and try to put them together. It's going to be about a 2-hour program, I think.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me, Alan. I enjoyed this. I hope that our attendees today took something away. If you have questions and you want to get in contact with me, feel free to email Alan and his team or however you would communicate, and he'll put you guys in contact. I'm happy to answer any specific questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you. Take care.